Jesus fell on his face in the dirt of an olive grove on the eastern slope of the Kidron Valley, and the man who would be crucified in less than 12 hours was not composed. He was not serene. He was not the calm figure the stained glass windows have taught you to expect. Matthew, who spent 3 years walking beside him, reached for a word he had never used before and would never use again in his entire gospel, adaimonein. And that word does not mean sorrow. It does not mean sadness. It does not even mean grief, as we normally understand grief. In the tiny body of surviving Greek literature where it appears at all, adaimonein describes the specific psychological state of a person who has lost their bearings, the ground under them dissolving, the familiar categories collapsing, the self becoming unrecognizable to itself. It is the word a soldier uses when he cannot remember why he is holding a sword. It is the word a traveler uses when the road he has walked 100 times suddenly looks like nowhere he has ever been. Matthew watched Jesus in that garden, and when he later picked up a pen to write Matthew 26:37, he refused to use the ordinary Greek word for grief, lipe, which he had used elsewhere without hesitation. He chose adaimonein instead. He chose the rarer, harsher, more disorienting word, because what he saw in that grove was not sadness. It was a man who had stopped being able to stand. And by the end of what you are about to hear, 3 things will belong to you. You will know exactly what adaimonein meant to a first-century reader, the precise weight of the word Matthew chose, and why no translation in your Bible carries it fully. You will know what the cup meant, not as metaphor, not as poetry, but as a specific and terrifying image every Jewish ear in the first century would have recognized instantly from the Hebrew Scriptures. And you will know the answer to the question that has sat unanswered in pulpits for 1900 years. If the Son of God knew with absolute certainty that he would rise on the 3rd day, what exactly was he afraid of? Because it was not what you have been told. If this is the kind of work you want, the slow, careful unearthing of what the text actually says under the translations you have inherited, subscribe now, and you will not miss what we do here. Return to the garden. It is somewhere around the 2nd hour of the night, Thursday, the 14th of Nisan, in the year most historians place between 30 and 33 A.D. The Passover lamb has been eaten. Judas is already walking through the streets of Jerusalem toward the house of the high priest. Jesus has crossed the Kidron with 11 men, and at the entrance to the olive grove called Gethsemane, the name itself means oil press, the place where olives are crushed until they bleed. He leaves 8 of them at the gate. He takes 3 deeper in, Peter, James, John, the same 3 who stood on the mountain of the Transfiguration and watched his face burn with a light that belonged to a world they had no vocabulary for. The same 3 who had seen him raise a 12-year-old girl from the dead in Capernaum. The 3 witnesses he had chosen to see him in glory are now the 3 witnesses he chooses to see him in collapse. That is not an accident. Matthew is telling you something by the symmetry. The same eyes that saw him blazing with uncreated light are now going to see him face down in the dust, sweating, asking to be spared. And then, the detail that cuts deepest, those 3 eyes close. Peter, James, and John fall asleep. 3 times, the men Jesus handpicked to be present with him in the worst hour of his life cannot keep their eyes open. The text records it without comment. Matthew does not editorialize. He simply writes that Jesus came back and found them sleeping, and went away, and came back and found them sleeping again. 12 men walked into that garden. By the end of the night, one will have sold him, one will have denied him 3 times before sunrise, and the other 10 will be running for their lives through the streets of a city that has decided to kill him. And before any of that happens, in the quietest moment of the gospel, Jesus falls. Luke, who was a physician by trade and paid attention to bodies, records in Luke 22:44 that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Matthew gives us the interior, Luke gives us the exterior. Together, they give us something no ancient hagiography would ever have dared to write about a figure they considered divine, a God who could not stand up under what was coming. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the chapter turns inward. Maybe you know exactly what a Gethsemane feels like. Maybe you're in a season where your faith has not gone away. You still believe, you still show up, you still kneel. But the ground underneath the belief has shifted, and you cannot find the footing you used to have. Not doubt. Something stranger than doubt. Disorientation inside the faith itself. The prayers you used to pray with confidence now feel like they are being said by someone else, somewhere else, and you are watching from a distance. That is not a failure of belief. That is a human state that has a name in the gospel, and it was the state Jesus inhabited on the last night of his life. He did not sidestep it. He did not rise above it. He went into it, face down in the dirt, with 3 of his closest friends asleep 10 yards away, and the torches of the arresting party already visible through the trees. The English translations soften what Matthew recorded. They give you troubled. They give you distressed. They give you deeply grieved. None of these carries the weight of the word Matthew actually used. A Gethsemane is the sound of a man whose internal world has come apart. Athanasius, writing in Alexandria in the 4th century, would later insist that the Son did not stage this moment. He lived it. He was not performing human weakness for pedagogical purposes. He was experiencing it, because he had taken a human nature fully and was now standing at the threshold of what that nature was not built to bear. And then, in the middle of that collapse, he began to pray. He asked for one thing. He asked for the cup to be taken away. He prayed it once. He prayed it a second time. He prayed it a third. And the words he used, the specific image he reached for, would have stopped the heart of every Jewish listener within earshot. He asked the Father to remove the cup. What exactly was in that cup? Jesus used a word that every Jew within the sound of his voice would have recognized on the instant. Not a generic word for suffering, not a vague image of hardship. He reached into the Hebrew Scriptures and pulled out one of the most specific and terrifying pictures the prophets had ever drawn, the cup. And if you grew up reading the Gospels in English, you have almost certainly read that word as a poetic flourish, a sad, resigned metaphor for whatever was coming. It is not. It was never that. For a first-century Jewish mind steeped in Isaiah and the Psalms, the cup was not a symbol of personal pain. It was a technical term. It had a defined theological content. And that content was one thing, and one thing only: the concentrated wrath of God poured out against sin. Isaiah 51:17 puts it without any ambiguity. Awake, awake, stand up, O Jerusalem. which hast drunk at the hand of the Lord the cup of his fury. Thou hast drunken the dregs of the cup of trembling, and wrung them out. Psalm 75:8. For in the hand of the Lord there is a cup, and the wine is red. It is full of mixture, and he poureth out of the same. But the dregs thereof, all the wicked of the earth, shall wring them out, and drink them. Jeremiah 25:15. The prophet stands with the cup of the wrath of God in his hand, and is told to make every nation drink it. Every nation, every knee, every mouth. That is the cup. That is the image sitting in the bones of every Jewish man and woman who heard Jesus speak that word in the garden. It is not the cup of dying. It is the cup of judgment, the concentrated, distilled, undiluted response of absolute holiness. To everything, absolute holiness was not built to touch. And now, hold that image against what Jesus was actually asking. He was not asking to avoid the nails. He was not asking to avoid the mockery, the whip, the thorns, the slow suffocation that Roman crucifixion was engineered to produce. Men had died that death before him. Men would die that death after him, thousands of them. Josephus, writing near the end of the first century, recorded that during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., the Roman army crucified so many Jews outside the city walls that they ran out of wood and ran out of space. Crucifixion was not rare. The physical mechanism of that death was a known quantity in the ancient world, and Jesus, who had 3 times predicted the specifics of his own execution to his disciples, knew exactly what was coming physically. That is not what he was afraid of. Read the prayer again. Let this cup pass from me. He is not pointing at the cross. He is pointing at what is inside the cup. And what is inside the cup is something no human being in the history of the world had ever been asked to drink to the bottom. Here is where the theological weight of the moment finally lands. Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria from 328 until his death in 373 A.D., spent his entire adult life defending one specific claim, that the Son of God had taken a real and full human nature, and that he had taken it precisely so he could do something no one else could do. In his treatise on the Incarnation, written sometime around 318 A.D., when he was still a young deacon, Athanasius formulated it this way: the Word assumed a body so that what belonged to the body might become his, and what belonged to him might become the body's. He was describing an exchange, and the exchange reaches its absolute edge in the garden. The one who had never known sin was about to take into himself the entire concentrated weight of human sin, every betrayal, every cruelty, every cold calculation, every abandonment, every lie told to a child, every name spoken with contempt, every act of violence from Cain onward to the last man who will ever live. All of it, not observed from a distance, absorbed, taken into a body and a soul that had never known what sin felt like from the inside. Imagine, for a moment, the purest thing you have ever encountered: a newborn child, a mountain at dawn, a silence in a chapel before anyone else has walked in. Now, imagine pouring into that purity everything that has ever broken the world. That is the category of fear Jesus was standing inside. It is not the fear of physical pain. Pain he could name. This was different. This was the fear of becoming, for one terrible moment, something he had never been and was never created to be. Stay here for a second, because this is where the chapter turns toward you. Maybe you are standing in front of something you have never done before and cannot imagine doing. A diagnosis you're about to hear read aloud. A conversation you have been avoiding for 11 months and can no longer postpone. A role, parent, caregiver, widow, survivor, that you did not choose and are not sure you can carry. The fear is not cowardice. The fear is not weakness. The fear is the honest response of a creature to a weight it was not built to lift. That is exactly the category Jesus was in. Not ordinary fear. The fear of the unknown burden. And what the garden tells you is that the Son of God did not pretend the weight was small. He did not whisper pious affirmations to himself. He fell on his face and named it for what it was. The cup of wrath is a phrase that makes modern ears uncomfortable, and the discomfort is usually translated into softening. We prefer a God who is gentle in a way that does not require anything to be set right. But every prophet in the Hebrew Scriptures understood that holiness and moral indifference cannot occupy the same sentence. A God who looked at Auschwitz and Rwanda and the long, slow cruelty of every ordinary marriage gone wrong and simply shrugged would not be holy. He would be complicit. The cup exists because the holiness exists. And the staggering claim of the gospel is that the one who formulated that cup is the one who volunteered to drink it. John Chrysostom, preaching in Antioch near the end of the 4th century, told his congregation that the horror of Gethsemane was not a failure of courage, but a proof of reality, that what Jesus was about to do was so weighty that only a true human nature could feel its full edge, and only a true divine person could carry it through. Remove either half, and the garden collapses into theater. Keep both, and the garden becomes the hinge of history. And so he prayed 3 times. One answer, silence. And then an angel. Jesus prayed the first time, and the Father did not answer. He got up, walked back to the 3 men he had brought with him, found them sleeping, woke them, and went back into the dark. He prayed the second time. Matthew 26:42 records the shift in the wording. "O my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done." The petition is still there, but something in the grammar has moved. The first prayer asked for removal. The second prayer begins to name the condition under which removal is not possible. He is not arguing with the Father. He is working out, in real time, in the dust of that olive grove, what surrender looks like when surrender costs everything. And then a third time, the same petition, the same submission, and still silence. No voice from heaven as at the Jordan. No cloud of glory as on the mountain. No thunder, no reassurance, no explanation of why the cup cannot be taken away. Just the wind through the olive branches and the distant sound of the 3 closest friends breathing in their sleep. And then Luke, and only Luke, records the thing that happened next. Luke 22:43. "And there appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him." Read that verse slowly. The angel did not remove the cup. The angel did not explain the cup. The angel did not tell Jesus that what he was feeling was an overreaction, or that the weight was less than it appeared. The angel came and strengthened him. That is the verb Luke uses, aniskion, to infuse with strength from outside. Heaven did not answer the prayer the way the prayer had been framed. Heaven answered the prayer underneath the prayer. The petition was, "Let the cup pass." The answer was, "You will be given what you need to drink it." That is not the answer most of us are taught to expect when we pray in extremity. And it is worth staying inside that gap for a moment, because the gap is where most honest lives are actually lived. You have almost certainly prayed a prayer that was not answered the way you asked. Maybe for the healing that did not come. Maybe for the marriage that did not hold. Maybe for the child who did not return home. Maybe for the season of darkness that refused to end on the timeline you begged for. The temptation, and it is a powerful one, is to conclude from the unanswered petition that you were not heard. Gethsemane says otherwise. Gethsemane says that sometimes the deepest answer heaven gives is not the removal of the burden, but the strength to carry what cannot be removed, and the strength does not always arrive as a feeling. Sometimes it arrives as the ability to stand up after the third prayer and walk toward what you were praying to avoid. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, from 395 until 430, returned to this scene again and again in his sermons. In one sermon, preserved under the title Sermo 31, he drew a distinction that still holds centuries later. He separated two movements inside every honest prayer: the petitio, which is the request the creature brings, and the voluntas, which is the will of the Father that stands above the request. Every real prayer contains both. The mistake, Augustine told his congregation in Hippo, is to imagine these two movements as opponents, as if the Father's will defeats the Son's request. They are not opponents. The Son's request is real. The Son's request is honest. The Son is not performing. He genuinely asks for the cup to be removed. But the request is placed inside a larger trust, and the larger trust is what makes the request safe to make. Not as I will, but as thou wilt, is not the sentence of a defeated son. It is the sentence of a son who has absolute confidence that the Father sees what the Son cannot see from inside the horror of the moment. That is a theologically enormous difference. A defeated prayer ends in resignation. A trusting prayer ends in surrender. They look similar from a distance. They are opposite in substance. Resignation says, I give up because I have no choice. Surrender says, I give over because the one I am giving to knows what I do not know. Jesus did not resign in the garden. He surrendered. And the difference is the entire distance between despair and obedience. Hold that for a second, because it is probably the most important thing in this chapter. Maybe you have a prayer that has been in the queue so long, you have almost stopped expecting an answer. You have stopped saying it out loud. You still bring it into the chapel. You still fold your hands over it, but you have quietly stopped waiting for the specific outcome you originally asked for. What Gethsemane tells you is that the silence is not evidence of abandonment. The silence is the space inside which a different kind of answer is being prepared. The answer that does not remove the weight, but hands you the strength to carry what you thought would break you. That is not a small thing. That is the exact shape of what the Son himself was given on the night of the 14th of Nisan. He did not get deliverance. He got an angel. And the angel was enough. Notice what happens next in the narrative. After the angel, Jesus does something Matthew records almost without comment. He stands up. The Greek is egertheus. He rose. He got to his feet. The same body that had been face down in the dirt, the same soul that had cried out 3 times for release, now, strengthened from outside, stood. And when Judas and the arresting party arrived with torches and swords at the entrance of the olive grove, it is Jesus who walked toward them. John 18:4 is precise about this. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? The verb is ektelthen. He went out. He did not wait to be found. He did not hide behind the disciples. He did not try to negotiate. The man who had asked 3 times for the cup to pass now moved toward the cup voluntarily. And that movement is only possible because of what the angel did. Strength from outside made possible obedience from inside. The horror did not vanish. The dread did not evaporate. The cup did not shrink by a single drop, but something had been added to the one who would drink it. This is the pattern every honest life of prayer eventually recognizes. The prayer for escape is answered by the gift of endurance. The prayer for the mountain to move is answered by the grace to walk up it. The prayer for the wound to close is answered, sometimes for decades, by the quiet provision of enough breath for one more day. None of this is a consolation prize. This is the deepest texture of how the God of Gethsemane operates with the ones he loves. He does not always take the cup away. He does not always explain, but he sends what is needed to drink what must be drunk. And then, when the angel had strengthened him, and the dread was still in his body, but no longer had the final word, he rose, and he went to meet the men who had come for him. Jesus walked toward the torches with fears still in his body. That is the detail the tradition almost never lets itself sit with. The dread that had pressed him into the dirt did not disappear when the angel left. The sweat that Luke described, the kind that falls like drops of blood when a human being is pushed past every natural limit of endurance, was still drying on his face and in his beard when he spoke to the men who had come to bind him. He was not numb. He was not in some elevated mystical state that had carried him above ordinary feeling. He was a man who was terrified, and who walked toward the thing that terrified him anyway. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in the garden, because it is the distinction the modern imagination cannot keep straight. We have inherited a strange idea of courage. We think of it as the absence of fear. The brave are the ones who do not feel it. The cowardly are the ones who do. Gethsemane dismantles that picture with one sentence of narrative. The bravest act in the history of the world was performed by a man whose body had been shaking less than an hour earlier. The courage of Jesus in the garden is not the courage of someone who has risen above his humanity. It is the courage of someone who has kept his humanity fully intact and has chosen inside it to move toward what his humanity is begging him to flee. Cyril of Jerusalem, who served as bishop of that city from roughly 350 until his death in 386, addressed this question directly in his catechetical lectures, a series of instructions he delivered to candidates preparing for baptism. Cyril was responding to a specific error that had begun to creep into the preaching of his day, the idea that the human nature of Christ could not really feel what ordinary humans feel, that the fear in the garden was a kind of staged display for our benefit, that the Son was internally unmoved while externally he wept. Cyril refused that picture. He told his congregation in substance that if the human nature of Christ had been insulated from real dread, then the compassion of Christ for dreading humans would be a performance too. A God who did not actually feel what we feel cannot actually meet us where we feel it. The entire bridge collapses, and Cyril, standing in the very city where Gethsemane still sits, less than a mile from his cathedral, understood that the whole weight of the gospel depended on keeping that bridge intact. The fear was real, and because the fear was real, the solidarity is real. And because the solidarity is real, he knows, from the inside, what it costs you to do the thing you are most afraid of doing. Let that land for a moment, because it changes something. The category you have been taught to reach for when you're afraid is usually explanation. You want to understand why the thing is happening. You want a framework that makes the fear smaller. You want the weight interpreted. What Gethsemane offers instead is not explanation. It is company. It is the presence of someone who has been there, not in metaphor, not in poetic analogy, but in the literal specifics of a body that could not stop shaking and a soul that asked 3 times for a way out and did not receive one. Maybe there is something you're about to walk toward right now, and you have been waiting for the fear to subside before you move. You have been telling yourself that once you feel ready, you will take the step, and the fear has not subsided. The conversation you need to have has not become easier. The decision you need to make has not become clearer. The thing you need to say to the person who will be hurt by hearing it has not stopped costing you to say it. What Gethsemane tells you is that readiness is not the condition. The Son of God did not wait for the dread to leave before he stood up. He stood up inside the dread. The strength the angel brought was not the strength that removes fear. It was the strength that allows movement while fear is still present. And that is the only kind of strength most real human lives ever actually need. Nobody gets the version where the fear evaporates. Everyone who has ever done a hard thing has done it while afraid. The difference between those who move and those who stay frozen is not the absence of fear in the ones who move. It is the presence of something, grace, love, conviction, obligation, the quiet strength that comes from somewhere else, that makes the movement possible inside the fear. Origen, writing in Alexandria around 230 A.D., put it in a sentence that has carried for 1,800 years. He told his readers that the Son of God did not come to remove our fears, but to make our fears no longer the loudest voice in the room. That is precisely what the walk from the olive grove to the torches enacts. The fear was in the room. It was not the loudest voice in the room. The loudest voice was the trust the Son had in the Father, the surrender that Augustine would later name centuries after Origen's death. And that trust did not drown out the fear. It simply outranked it. There is a kind of peace that comes from the fear being taken away. There is another kind of peace, deeper, stranger, harder, that comes from the fear still being present and no longer being in charge. Gethsemane teaches the second kind. And here is the consequence for everything that follows in your own life. You have a God who knows, not theoretically, but experientially, what it is to move toward something terrifying. The incarnation was never only about Christmas, about the small body in the manger and the song of the shepherds. It was also about this, about a body that could feel dread in its bones, about a nervous system that registered the full weight of what was coming, about a soul that did not sidestep its own humanity in order to be obedient, but carried that humanity all the way through. The God you are praying to when you pray in your own fear is not a God who has only read about it. He has been there, in the dirt, with no answer from heaven, and he got up. That is the God who is listening to you right now, and it is the God who, 20 centuries ago on the 14th of Nisan, walked out of the olive grove to meet the men with the torches, because the thing he had come to do was more important than the thing that was terrifying him. 3 promises were made at the beginning of this. It is time to close them. The first promise was a demonean. You now know what it means. You know that Matthew reached past the ordinary Greek word for grief and chose the rarer, sharper term, the one that names not sadness, but disorientation, the collapse of the inner ground, the state of a self that can no longer locate itself. You know that the translations you have carried in your hands all your life have softened that word to distressed, to troubled, to deeply grieved, and that none of those English equivalents carry what Matthew actually saw. That promise is closed. The second promise was the cup. You now know it was never a metaphor for general suffering. You know it was a technical term drawn from the prophets, a specific image of the concentrated response of absolute holiness against everything that breaks the world. And you know the Son of God was not asking to avoid the nails. He was asking to avoid what the nails were the doorway into. That promise is closed. And the third promise was the question 1900 years of pulpits have circled without always landing on. What was the Son of God afraid of if he knew with certainty that the third day was coming? And the answer is the one the fathers of the first 5 centuries, from Athanasius in Alexandria to Augustine in Hippo, kept arriving at when they sat with the text honestly. He was not afraid of pain. He was not afraid of death. He was afraid of becoming, for the space of one terrible transaction, the carrier of everything he had never been. He was afraid of the exchange Athanasius named in 318 A.D., the one who had never known sin, taking sin into a body and a soul that had never been touched by it. That is a category of dread that had no precedent in the history of the world, and it has had no repetition since. That promise is closed, and what that leaves you with is something small enough to carry and large enough to change how you sleep tonight. I do not know exactly what you carried into this. Maybe you came because something is coming tomorrow morning that you do not know how to walk toward, and you wanted to hear that you are not the first to feel this. Maybe you came because a prayer you have been whispering for 9 months, or 2 years, or 11 years has received no answer in the shape you asked for, and you were starting to wonder if the silence meant you had not been heard. Maybe you came because your belief has not left you, but your footing inside it has. The prayers still leave your mouth, but they no longer feel like they land anywhere, and you cannot name when that started. Maybe you came because at 3 in the morning, the fear arrives with a specificity that no daylight argument can dismantle, and you lie there waiting for the window to turn gray and the voice in your chest to quiet, and it does not quiet. Maybe you came because you are watching someone you love suffer, and you have exhausted the things you know how to ask God for, and the weight of being unable to fix them is now a weight of its own. Every one of those weights was in that olive grove. Every one of them is what the word Ademonean was built to name. The dread the Son of God felt on the 14th of Nisan was not a different category from yours. It was the same category in a concentration none of us will ever be asked to feel. And what that means is that when you stand up tomorrow and do the thing you do not want to do, you will not be doing it alone. You will be doing it in the footprints of the one who stood up first, in the dirt of an olive press, with the torches already moving through the trees, and the strength given to him not as the removal of the weight, but as the sufficiency to carry it. The next time the fear arrives and will not leave, you will know the word for what it is, and the word will not make it smaller, but it will put you in company you did not have before. Lord, thank you for the word Matthew refused to soften. Thank you for letting us see the ground dissolve under the feet of your Son, so that we would know the ground dissolving under ours is not the end of the story. Thank you for an angel that did not remove the cup. Thank you for the strength that does not evaporate fear, but outranks it. We admit that most of what we carry, we would rather not carry. We admit that we have prayed for cups to pass and have not seen them pass. Send us what you sent him, not the version we asked for, the version we actually need. And when the dread arrives tonight, let us remember that it has a name in your gospel, and the name is not abandonment. Amen. One request before you leave. Drop a comment and tell me which moment stopped you. Was it a demonean, the word for the ground dissolving, the word Matthew used once and never again? Was it the cup, the specific image of judgment that every Jewish ear in the first century recognized? The cup the Son asked 3 times to have removed? Or was it the angel in Luke 22:43? The answer that was not an answer, the strength that did not change the situation, but changed the one who was carrying it? Tell me which one. I read every comment that comes in, and if you want to understand what happened in the hours that followed, what the kiss of Judas meant in the Greek verb John chose to describe it, why Peter swung a sword at a man named Malchus, and why Jesus healed that man on the spot, and what the silence of Christ before Caiaphas was actually accomplishing while it looked like defeat. That piece is waiting for you right here.